This is a talk that I've been kicking around for about 6 years, basically since I started learning how to code. And the title's a bit tongue-in-cheek, I'll admit that, but it'll make a little bit more sense as we go. I also want to mention that this talk is very anecdotal to my personal journey, so your mileage may vary, but hopefully you can still get something out of it. Just keep in mind, I'm going to be talking about myself a lot. Let's start here. I'm Nicole Carpenter. I am a principal software developer at a company called A-Flight based in Chicago, and I'm here because I'm a great developer. Great, so that covers half the title. This talk might not be for you. It's actually not even written for this audience. I wrote this talk for a coding bootcamp that I volunteer at called Code Platoon, and it's a coding bootcamp for veterans that's based in Chicago. And this is a talk that I think is great for junior developers, people that are just learning how to code. And to be honest, this is a talk that I actually wrote for myself. It's something that I would have wanted to hear as I was learning to code 6 years ago. And I know that this audience is full of smart, confident, well-adjusted developers, so this might not apply to you, but hopefully you can still get something out of it, because I think that the perspective is not that widely represented, and I think you'll still walk away having learned something. So let me give you a little background so you understand why I am qualified to give this talk. I started to learn to code in college, and to be honest, I didn't really love it. And coming out of college, it wasn't something that I thought, gosh, I want to do this for the rest of my life. I didn't think I was going to have a career as a developer. And a lot of the reason was because I really struggled with coding. I had to take a couple of programming classes just to get through my degree path. But during those classes, I didn't find the coding environment very supportive. A lot of times I would ask questions and the professor or my peers would give me this attitude like, Nicole, you're supposed to know this. This is an incredibly easy thing. Like, how come you don't know how to do this? I think there was an expectation that I should have learned or I should have known more going into the course than I did. And I found that really demotivating. It almost felt like Stack Overflow in real life. So at the end of that, I was like, I don't think this is for me. But when I Googled what is an entry-level job for IS majors, information systems management majors, I quickly learned that software development is basically everything Google recommends. So I decided to bite the bullet and look for vocational coding, which led me to a coding bootcamp. So I was part of Dev Bootcamp in its short life. Rest in peace. And Dev Bootcamp was actually a really great program, and I'm sure there's a lot of alumni in the audience here for that. So, but I do want to mention that Dev Bootcamp was actually probably the lowest point in my confidence. Dev Bootcamp was designed as a 9-week course, and it was split into 3 sections, and each section was 3 weeks. And the 9-week course could turn into a 15-week course if you just weren't getting it. And for me, that was the case. I repeated the first section and I repeated the second section because I just needed more time. I needed more time to understand what was going on. I needed more time to really take in what I was learning. And it was a little bit frustrating for me, but I was actually really glad for the opportunity to get that extra time. But one thing I noticed is a lot of people around me were having what they call these aha moments. You'll just get it eventually, Nicole. You'll just get that aha, like it'll rush in and you'll be like, I've got it, aha. And I never got those aha moments. Like all these things that were promised, I was like, they never came. And, I was thinking and considering that when I was like, what am I going to do when I finish this class? Like, I'm still not getting it. And I actually got a really good piece of advice from an alumni that came in, and it was a little bit hard to hear at the time, but what he said was that the discomfort that I was feeling in learning in that environment could very well follow me into my career as a developer. And he absolutely did not mean that to discourage me, although it maybe sounded like that at the time, or felt like that at the time. But what he was really trying to get at was that I need to be prepared and I needed to be realistic about how I learned. I need to make sure that I'm prepared to adapt to situations. I might not get things as easily as people around me, and I need to work really hard to get there. So once I finished my coding bootcamp, I was like, okay, great. I'm ready for my junior developer career now, which absolutely was not the case. But luckily for me, there was the apprenticeship that I went through at A-Flight. So A-Flight is very well known for their apprenticeship model, and I was slated for a 7-month apprenticeship. And basically, an apprenticeship at that point is you're being paid to learn. You're being paid to understand the fundamentals of, the level that they want every developer to be at with the fundamental things that we believe in with writing code. And that 7-month apprenticeship very quickly turned into a 9-month apprenticeship, which for me, I was, again, really happy to spend the extra time and not have that pressure of having to be a billable developer. But eventually, that did have to come to an end, and I've been working there for the last 4 years post-apprenticeship. And you're probably thinking, gosh, Nicole, you just sound like you have imposter syndrome. And for those of you who don't know what imposter syndrome is, it's a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. So, does that apply? I don't know. I don't think that I would ever accept that diagnosis, and I think there are a lot of people who feel that way. So, imposter syndrome is absolutely a real thing. There are definitely high-achieving people who genuinely fit that bill. But there are also a lot of average-achieving people, and maybe even below-average achieving people who still have careers as developers, and even successful careers as developers, but on the technical level, they're trying to tread water while their peers are swimming laps around them. And that's kind of how I've felt almost the entire time of my career. Actually, that's how I felt. And especially working for a company like A-Flight, I feel like everybody I work with is a genius. I feel like I work with the smartest people on the planet. And I know you're not supposed to compare yourself to other people. Comparison is a thief of joy. But it's really hard to not do that. And, I got that advice constantly. Don't compare yourselves to others. But I just don't know how to not compare myself to others. And especially, when you feel like you're on one of the polar ends of things. So, coming back to the idea of imposter syndrome, I think that the idea and the phrase imposter syndrome, telling somebody that they have imposter syndrome, maybe it applies, but it's not always as helpful as you think it is. It can sometimes be dismissive, for one. It doesn't recognize that there may be other issues at play, such as systemic racism and sexism and classism. But even if we put aside those major issues, sometimes people just need to acknowledge that the struggle is real. And once they acknowledge that, then they can move on and start to learn to address the fact that that struggle really exists. So, for the purpose of this talk, let's just assume that the struggle is real and that you're not a great coder, but you want to be, and you want to get there, and you want to be a great developer. So let's figure out how we get there. This is a quote I love. Anyone can cook. It's from the movie Ratatouille. It's a great movie. If you've never seen it, what are you doing? But I love to think of this quote in terms of coding because I absolutely believe that anyone can code. Anyone can learn to code given enough time and resources and drive. Obviously, take one of those things away, it's a different story. Somebody without resources is going to have a really, really hard time, a really hard go. Somebody who doesn't have the time to learn is also going to have a hard go. But, those elements are really all you need, and a computer, I guess, to learn how to code. So how do I be less bad at coding? It's definitely not an overnight thing. You have to put in the work. Coding involves time, and it involves exposure. Time means you're learning as you go. Exposure is another, learning as you go. You're going to get exposed to either, working on the job or exposure to different materials or learning from the people around you. And again, those things go hand in hand. Now, an important thing to know coming out of a college program, out of a CS program, out of a coding boot camp or an apprenticeship, or even if you're learning on, self-taught, you're not expected to know everything. A junior developer in their first job is not going to be expected to run a team. They're not going to be expected to be the genius on the staff. I mean, unless you're going into a situation where you are the only developer, then maybe the expectations will be a little bit higher. But more than likely, your expectations for yourself technically are may very well be higher than what the employer has expectations of you. The important thing is that you go in eager to learn and eager to contribute, and you're going to learn as you go. So, but obviously we have to address the fact that a lot of the job, a big, important, huge chunk of being a developer, being a coder, is writing code. So, right out of the gate, we're not going to be geniuses, we're not going to know everything, but how do we get better? I've learned a lot of things from mentoring. So I've mentioned that I work with the coding boot camps. I work with students from the coding boot camp. And there are a few fundamental things that I notice that all developers encounter on day one. And again, the theme here is learning with time. So these are things that require time to master, but recognizing the problem on day one, or early at least, helps us learn to build those skills as we get more experience. So one of those things is learning to break down problems. So breaking down problems basically just means into logical steps that a computer can execute. So capturing what the problem is that you're trying to solve. A good example I like to use is tic-tac-toe. Everybody knows how to play tic-tac-toe. But does the computer know how to play tic-tac-toe? No, the computer is dumb. You are the smart one. You have to tell the computer how to play tic-tac-toe, how to display a board, how to make a move, how to win the game. Those are all incremental steps that are going to be in your program that you're going to have to break down for the problem to be able to solve it. Again, this is something that you will encounter on day one, but you're going to get better over time. And I'm way better now than I was 5 years ago with this. Another struggle point day one is code maintenance. So I see a lot of people tripping over their code. And, different languages have different pitfalls. We have indentations for Python, Java, JavaScript, miss brackets. With Ruby, I write in Ruby. It's Rails comp, I'm assuming most people here do. There's the end of your def and your class. So all of these little things, again, you're going to see them on day one, but as you learn more as a developer, as you're exposed to more code, as you're exposed to more learning materials, you're going to realize that, learning how to write expressive naming in the style of the language and learning how to write clean code and understanding that you want to be able to follow the code and follow the program through and understand what's happening. Those are all things that are going to help you as you progress as a developer. And again, day one, not going to be a master at it, but you'll get there. And then finally, day one, reading the error message. Errors, essentially every developer is going to see an error every day of their career, most likely. And this is something that I wish I learned on day one. It took me probably a good 3-4 days to understand that I wasn't being yelled at. I wasn't being screamed at by the code. The errors are there to help me. And it's important to understand you don't want to be afraid of the error. Just read the error. And, they're trying to help. So one other thing I try to get at is teaching people that there are definitely different learning styles. And you may not know right out of the gate what you're going to use to best learn, but there are a lot of options. So some people list 7 different learning styles, some people list 3. I'm going to talk about 5. So the first one I'm going to talk about is visual learning. And visual, obviously, having to do with your eyes. So visual learning could include diagrams, such as UML. This is something that I'm really glad I spent a little bit of time on in college because it's been really helpful for me. Cheat sheets. Usually, if you're learning a new tool, Googling the tool and cheat sheet is very helpful. Whiteboards. Don't be scared. And videos. Videos are available on YouTube, Vimeo. They're all over the place. Auditory learning has to do with hearing, which includes podcasts, videos again, so there is some crossover with some of these, meetups, and lectures. Another learning style, and this one, there's a lot of room in this one. This one's very broad, is verbal. Verbal basically has to do with words in various forms. So this includes technical books. For most people, technical books means reading technical books, but I'm sure some of you out there are authors and have written books, or will be authors and will write books. And if that helps you learn, that's great, but it also helps other people learn. So good luck with that. Reading blogs. There are a lot of great ones out there. Writing blogs. This is another one. Writing blogs, it's something that I don't love doing, and I'll talk about that later, but it's really helpful for me to really drive home the point of what I'm learning. Note-taking is another one. Preparing talks. And documentation. And documentation works in a couple different ways. So this is reading and writing documentation. The next learning style is kinesthetic. This deals with touch and movement, action basically. This includes tutorials, projects, so basically just writing code. And with tutorials, I should have included, that could be like Code School and Code Academy, and Free Code Camp is another one a lot of people go through, and projects and hackathons. Contributing to open source. Again, this is writing code. Katas are something that I didn't know existed until I started at A-Flight. It's basically, it's a tool. I think the biggest benefit for katas is test-driven development. So katas are basically where you have a very basic problem. So say it's Roman numeral conversion, and you start with the smallest piece of the logic. So how do you convert 1 to a Roman numeral 1? And you go through and write the test, make the test fail, and then you write the code that passes the test. And you go through that through, gradually increasing logic, and you're writing the smallest, most basic way to pass the test. And then as you go and you have to build logic on top of that, you can refactor and move along in that process. And it's just one tool that you can use. And katas, if you really want to know the coolness about katas, check out katas on YouTube, because they're usually accompanied by some really cool techno music. That's another story. And then another thing I learned about at A-Flight is koans. Koans are a really interesting way to learn the basics of a language. Basically, it's a step-by-step thing where you'll have a test suite. The test suite will sort of guide you into how to solve a problem in a specific language, like addition or printing to the console or something like that. And you essentially have to write the code that passes the test before it lets you move on to the next test. So it's just an alternate way of learning a language. Social learning is the next one and last one that I'm going to talk about. So this includes meetups, hackathons, study groups, mentoring. Again, mentoring is good for the mentor and mentee. I'm going to say that a lot. And then mob and pair programming is a very, very social way of learning. So there are definitely ways that I've learned to recognize that I don't like learning. Sometimes I surprise myself, but mostly I think I have these ones down. So technical reading is one that I really struggle with. And I've actually heard this from a lot of people where, give me a technical book, I'm going to read the same page over and over and over again. I know this is not just a technical reading thing. Sometimes this is a regular book thing, and I know it's a symptom of ADHD, so there are a lot of people that just have difficulty with this sort of aspect of learning, and the great thing is that there are other ways that you can get around this. Lectures are another one. Lectures, unless I'm taking notes with my lecture, it's going to go straight over my head, or hopefully there's a recording and I can rewatch it. Hackathons and pair programming I'm going to put on the screen together. Now, this is a little controversial. Pair programming is very helpful, very beneficial. I shouldn't say very helpful. It's very beneficial because the idea of pair programming is that you're bringing two brains together. It's two heads are better than one. You're learning from the other person. They're learning from you. It's a good exercise in sharing problem solving. But for me personally, I don't love pair programming because for me, I feel like I'm just sweating the entire time. I'm like, how do I prevent this person from smelling the sweat because I'm so nervous and I'm just thinking about me sweating, and it's just like, it's just a nerve thing for me. I just am worried about making a fool of myself, which usually isn't the case, I usually have something to contribute, but gosh, that anxiety really gets to me, and that's why I don't find pair programming to be that beneficial. That being said, I just need more practice. Don't give up on pair programming. It's a great tool. Great. So there are ways that I definitely think I do learn. Tutorials is one of them. I once sat for a weekend, basically Friday to Sunday, learning Bootstrap, and Bootstrap is something that I still use to this day. Blogging. I mentioned blogging because I hate blogging, but I do know that it's very beneficial for me to learn. Just the act of learning something and writing it down helps me so much in retaining what I'm reading or what I'm watching or however I'm getting in the material. If I write it down, it helps a ton. Mentoring is another one. I've mentioned this before. Mentoring is great because even if you don't feel like you know enough to mentor, you absolutely do. There's always going to be somebody out there who knows less than you, and coding boot camps or high school, teach a 5-year-old to code. You definitely know more than a 5-year-old. And it's a great way to boost your confidence. Plus, when you're working with somebody and they're on kind of basic stuff, it's a good refresher for you. And then finally, documentation. This is my favorite. So documentation is, I think, the easiest way to contribute to a new team. And when I'm talking about documentation here, I'm talking about writing documentation. So obviously you can go to documentation when you're learning a new tool, learning a new language, and figure out what's going on there. But writing documentation is also great because it's that, pen to paper sort of thing, connecting the things in your brain. But it also helps other people learn because, for instance, when you go on a new team, maybe their process isn't documented well of getting the app up and running or getting their environment up and running. When you can write documentation that goes through the steps that you had to take, it's going to help all of the people that follow you get to that point as well. And then finally, the last lesson I like to give people, that this was a lesson that was given to me, and to be honest, it's not something I always follow, but it's a good one, is exposing your ignorance. And that essentially just means ask questions when you have questions. You don't want to struggle in silence. We've all been where you are, and asking questions will not only help you, but it probably will help other people who are also afraid to ask questions. One strategy that I've used for asking questions is we have a Slack at work that is basically like ask for help. And sometimes I feel like my questions are silly. And I know that no, there's no silly questions. Like anybody can benefit from what you're asking. But when I get to that point where I'm just like really doubting myself, I'm questioning what I'm doing, I don't want to embarrass myself, I have allies. Like if I have a JavaScript question, I don't write JavaScript regularly. So sometimes I'll need a JavaScript thing where I'm like, I feel like I should be able to figure this out. But I know somebody who is willing to help me on that JavaScript thing because they love writing in JavaScript, and that's their thing. And I feel like I can safely go to that person and ask this question, and they won't judge me, and they'll make me feel safe when I'm asking it. I obviously like to spread it around. I don't want to put all this pressure on one person, but having built allies to where I can go to these people and ask questions. Another good example of this is finding a mentor, because mentors are usually somebody that can help you through this process as well. And again, my questions that I think of as dumb, that's just a confidence thing for me. You always hear that phrase, there are no stupid questions. Just keep that in mind. But like I said, if you don't feel confident to ask those questions, then building allies is a good strategy. All right, we've rounded the corner. We've discussed improving your coding abilities over time, but let's say that time has not yet elapsed and you're still not there. So you could still be a great developer. That's the moral of my talk. You can still be a great developer even if you aren't a great coder yet. And again, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning of this talk. This is very, very specific to my journey. It involves a lot of work that I do in order to use my strengths. And my strengths are being the hardest worker that exists, but that's not the only way to be a great developer. So again, your mileage may vary. I'm not giving advice. I just want to relate my story and maybe you can relate to it. So one of the strategies that I use to be a great developer is I don't say no to things. And this is something that I learned in the military. And it's actually the opposite of the advice that you're supposed to take. You're not supposed to volunteer for things in the military, but I did. And it was a great experience for me. In the military, I got to do many things that I would have never been able to do in real life had I not volunteered my time. Obviously, volunteering means that there's a cost to it, your free time. And it's important to make sure that the benefit that you get out of volunteering for things is equal to or greater than the cost. So that's just kind of a personal calculation that you have to do for yourself. But again, volunteering for me was a great way to expose me to different things or different people or different experiences in the military that I would have never been able to do. For instance, I get to release doves at Clint Eastwood's manor. Who does that? So that's kind of where I started to learn that strategy. And since then, I've adapted that into my career as a developer. So I do a lot, and I work really hard, and I spend a lot of time on things that aren't my coding job. I run 2 meetup groups. I co-organize a third. I volunteer. I help write a weekly newsletter. I have my hand in a lot of buckets. So that's just kind of how I roll. And again, the cost is time, but the benefit for me is the exposure. So there's other ways that you can contribute while you're also getting the benefit. So again, this is the cost benefit thing. The cost is time. The benefit is learning in this case. So one way is learning something and then teaching what you learned. So doing the research, sharing what you learned. This could be in a blog form or in a talk, writing down your notes, writing down documentation again, which I added here. It's a way to facilitate learning. So hosting tech events, again, that's something that I do. I helped host an internal conference at my job, and everybody benefited, but so did I. And then another way is to mentor. This is the last time I hope I'll mention this because it is such an important thing. There were so many people that helped me in my journey that I think it's really important to give back. So mentoring, you could take on an apprentice like we have the opportunity to do so in our system of learning here at 8th and then another option is to mentor in the community. So there are absolutely ways that you can contribute or be a great developer without actually spending time on those things. And, maybe you have a family or maybe your extra time that you're spending beyond your job, you want to spend learning. And that's completely reasonable. Absolutely. So there are a lot of non-technical attributes that still will make you a great developer that you want to keep in mind. So one of them is having a positive attitude. This basically means you want to be the kind of person that you would want on your own team. Another one is being a good communicator. This takes a lot of forms. So this includes how you speak to people, on the day-to-day, asking questions. I mentioned before, exposing your ignorance, but asking questions is great because a lot of times other people have the same question, but they're afraid or don't want to speak up and ask it. So when you ask questions, other people learn as well. PR feedback is a way to communicate as well. When you're very deliberate about the merge requests or pull requests that you review and you give feedback that is going to help the person improve. And communication can also involve documenting the processes that you find difficult. Being intellectually curious. This one's kind of weird. It's a little tough to tell somebody to be intellectually curious. It's like telling somebody to be passionate. So intellectual curiosity basically just means increasing your exposure to new things. spending a little time each day reading or writing code, and eventually that's going to build you up to like, what can I learn next that's sort of involved in this thing that I'm learning? Being responsible, on the other hand, is a little bit more cut and dry. Follow through. Do what you say you're going to do. Good developers are also empathetic. Great developers are usually great people, and great people are people that care about other people on their team. And finally, being open-minded. There are a lot of people with a lot of experiences out there, and you want to be open to new ideas and learning from the people around you. And the last lesson is preserve your sanity. You are on your own journey. What helps you will be different from what helps other people. What makes me a great developer? It's not a one-size-fits approach. It involves a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort. That's my journey. You want to explore what makes you a great developer, because it might not be the same thing. You don't need to work a 60-hour work week. I don't even work a 60-hour work week in order to get you to that level, but it's up to you to figure out what makes you a great developer.